If you thought the end of Dune was a victory, you weren't paying attention. Dune Messiah isn't the story of a hero rising, it is the tragedy of a god falling. It's been 12 years since Paul Muad'Dib seized the throne. His holy war has killed 61 billion people across the known universe. And now, everyone wants him dead. The Space Guild, the Bene Gesserit, even his own wife, Princess Irulan. But Paul's biggest enemy isn't an assassin. It's his own vision of the future. A future he is desperately trying to escape. In this video, we are breaking down the dark, political, and heartbreaking story of Dune Messiah. We're talking about the conspiracy, the Ghola, and the ending that changes the Dune universe forever. Let's dive in.
12 years have passed since Paul Atreides led the Fremen to victory over the Harkonnens and the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV. 12 years of blood, 12 years of the jihad. The universe has been remade in the image of a god emperor, but in the shadows of this new holy empire, the seeds of dissent are being sown. We begin not in the royal palace of Arrakeen, but in a death cell. Bronso of Ix, a historian, a scholar, and now a condemned man, awaits execution. He is here because he dared to look past the myth of Muad'Dib. The priest, a servant of Paul's own state religion, questions him. What led you to take your particular approach to a history of Muad'Dib? Bronso's answer is a challenge to the very foundation of the empire. He tells the priest that the common view of the planet Dune is shallow. History, he says, is obsessed with the desert, the Fremen, and the still suits. These are surface truths. To truly understand what has happened to the human race, one must look beneath the sand. Bronso of Ix represents the first crack in the facade. He points out the ultimate irony of the sacred spice, melange. It gives life, yes, it allows for the foresight of the future, but it is also a cruel addiction. It turns the eyes of the user into a single, contrastless blue, a single view. And that is the problem with Paul's empire. It has lost its contrast. It has become a monolithic machine of faith. When the priest accuses Bronso of heresy, the historian laughs. I was brought to this cell by your priests. As with all priests, you learnt early to call the truth heresy. Bronso's crime was documenting how Paul Atreides lost his humanity to become a god. He spoke of the death of Paul's father, the sacrifice of Duncan Idaho, and the way Paul's mother, the Lady Jessica, used the Bene Gesserit mental arts to train a messiah. Bronso revealed the uncomfortable truth that Muad'Dib was the Sisterhood's Kwisatz Haderach, a captive messiah, long before he was the Fremen's prophet. As Bronso of Ix prepares for his end, he leaves us with a terrifying thought. The jihad that claimed 61 billion lives wasn't just a war, it was an ecological transformation. But more than that, it was a sham. Paul's marriage to Princess Irulan is a political hollow shell. His true mate remains the Fremen woman Chani. Bronso's analysis of history is not just a book, it is the rallying cry for a conspiracy that is already in motion. The ancient power groups of the universe have been united by 12 years of blood, and they are coming for the throne. To understand why the universe is conspiring against Paul Atreides, we must understand the nature of his power. Paul is the Mentat Emperor. He possesses a mind that surpasses the ancient mechanical computers, capable of processing infinite variables of data to predict the future. He is also the master of the spice. By capturing Arrakis, Paul gained monopoly over the ultimate coin of the realm, melange. Without it, the Bene Gesserit Reverend Mothers cannot perform their feats of observation. Without it, the Spacing Guild Steersmen cannot navigate the stars, and billions of citizens across the universe would die from withdrawal. But there is a failure implicit in this supreme power, as the Muad'Dib Concordance tells us. Completely accurate and total prediction is lethal. Paul's oracular vision has trapped him. He can see the future, but in seeing it, he makes it inevitable. He is a prisoner of his own foresight. History tells us that Muad'Dib was defeated by plotters, the Guild, the Sisterhood, and the Tleilaxu. They say his power was clouded by the Dune Tarot and the presence of a Ghola. But the deeper truth is that prophecy itself was the poison. We move now to Wallach 9, the homeworld of the Bene Gesserit. Here, under a blue-white sun, 4 of the most dangerous people in the universe have gathered in secret. This is the heart of the conspiracy. First, there is Edric, a guild steersman. He doesn't look human. He is an elongated fish-like creature swimming in a tank filled with orange melange gas. His presence is vital because a navigator's prescience creates a shroud. Paul's oracular sight cannot see what happens in the presence of another oracle. Edric is their shield. Second, there is Gaius Helen Moyam, the Reverend Mother of the Bene Gesserit. She is a black-robed stick figure, a witch crone with a face like a leathery mask. She is the woman who once tested Paul with the Gom Jabbar, and she has never forgiven him for becoming a messiah she cannot control. Third, there is Princess Irulan, the daughter of the deposed emperor. She is Paul's wife in name only. She is a tall, blonde beauty, but behind her aristocrat's hauteur is a bitter woman who's been denied the one thing she desires, to be the founding mother of a royal dynasty. And finally, there is Skytail. Skytail is a Tleilaxu face dancer. He is a human chameleon. At this meeting, he chooses the form of a bloated dumpling, a round-faced, vapid man. But Skytail is perhaps the most dangerous of them all. He represents the Bene Tleilax, the scientific amoralists who deal in the forbidden arts of cloning and genetic manipulation. The atmosphere in the dome is tense. They speak in Mira Bhasa, a language of fine emotional subtleties and sharp consonants. They are arguing about psychic poison. Edric, arrogant and dismissive, believes they can simply out-prophesy Paul. But Skytail laughs. "You wish to draw me into this fool's fight?" Skytail asks. "We are dealing with a potential messiah. You don't launch a frontal attack upon such a one. Martyrdom would defeat us." Skytail is the master of the room. He understands that to defeat a god, you must attack his soul, not his body. He mocks the great schools, the Guild and the Bene Gesserit for their blind adherence to dogma. He uses atonals in his speech, sounds that only he truly understands. He insults the Reverend Mother to her face, telling her she is not a sex object and never has been. It is a gutter insult, designed to test her control and to establish his dominance. The conspiracy needs a lever. They discuss the various power groups they can turn against Paul. The Choam Corporation? They follow profit. The Kizeret, Paul's own religious arm. They can be turned through envy. The Landsraad, they can be manipulated through politics. But they need something more intimate, a ghost. Edric reveals the weapon. The Atreides will defeat himself, he cries. He speaks of a revenant, a gift for the emperor. Irulan is skeptical. What is this ghost? Edric's answer sends a chill through the room. The flesh of a renowned swordmaster known as Duncan Idaho. Duncan Idaho is dead. Paul saw him die protecting him from the Sardaukar. But the Tleilaxu have a process. They take the cells of the dead and grow them in axolotl tanks to create a Gola. A Gola is a clone, but one without the memories of its original life. It is a blank slate of flesh, retrained with new skills. Skytail shows them what they have created. He shifts his shape to show Irulan the appearance of this new creature. They have named the Gola Hate. But Hate is not just a clone, he is a multi-purpose weapon. He has been trained as a mentat. The Reverend Mother Mohiam is horrified. A mentat? That's a dangerous move. She remembers the Butlerian Jihad, the ancient war against thinking machines. To the Bene Gesserit, a human computer is as terrifying as a machine. Why would the Tleilaxu give Paul a mentat Gola of his best friend? Skytail explains the trap. Hate will be accurate. If Paul asks the Gola why he was sent as a gift, Hate will tell the truth. He will say he was sent to destroy Paul. "So you leave an escape door open for Paul," Irulan says. Skytail smiles. It makes no difference. The plan is subtle and cruel. Hate is designed to poison Paul's psyche. He reflects the old morality that Paul learned on his homeworld of Caladan. By bringing back the face of his mentor, the conspirators hope to force Paul to enlarge his moral nature until it breaks. And there is another target, Alaya, Paul's sister. Alaya is a preborn, an abomination in the eyes of the Bene Gesserit. She was born with the full genetic memory of all her ancestors. She is a woman child with the wisdom of centuries and the passions of a teenager. Skytail intends for Hate to distract her. A charming, skilled male designed specifically to attract her to pull her away from her brother's side. Irulan is the final piece of the puzzle. She has been secretly administering contraceptives to Paul's concubine Chani to ensure that no Atreides heir is born. She wants her own bloodline on the throne. Edric baits her with the promise of a royal dynasty. He tells her that unless she joins them, she will never share Paul's bed. The Emperor is more firmly wedded to his Fremen concubine than you are. Irulan realizes she is on trial. If she leaves this meeting without committing, the conspirators might kill her. But she also sees the potential. If she joins them, she might finally get the power she has been denied for 12 years. She asks Skytail about the Tleilaxu system of honor, that their victims must always have a means of escape. Skytail agrees, if they can but find it. Is Paul a victim? Is Irulan? In the eyes of the Tleilaxu, everyone is matter to be manipulated. Energy learns, Skytail tells her. This we call power. As the meeting on Valok 9 concludes, the trap is set. The conspiracy has its shield, Edric, its political insider, Irulan, its master of shadows, Mohiam, and its poison, Skytail and Hate. They are betting on one thing, that Paul Atreides is still human enough to be hurt. They believe that by giving him back the thing he loves most, Duncan Idaho, they can destroy the god he has become. But they have forgotten one thing. Paul is not just a man, and he's not just a prophet. He's a mentat who has seen the end of the universe. As Irulan says, Mektub al-Melah. The thing was written with salt. The tragedy of Muad'Dib has begun its final chapter. In the next episode, we will see the return of the dead, the struggle for an heir, and the moment the Emperor realizes that his greatest enemy is his own past. Every civilization must contend with an unconscious force which can block, betray, or countermand almost any conscious intention of the collectivity. This is the unproven Tleilaxu theorem. It is a warning that no matter how powerful a leaguer becomes, the tide of human history, the collective unconscious of the species, is a beast that cannot be fully tamed. Paul Atreides, known to the stars as Muad'Dib, is learning this lesson in the most painful way possible. He has won the universe, but he's losing his grip on his own life. It is late in the imperial city of Arrakeen. A lone man walks the streets. To the pilgrims and the shopkeepers, he is just another wild Fremen, one of the desert-hardened warriors who keep the peace with a casual threat of violence. They give him a wide berth out of prudence. They do not know that the man behind the mouth filter is the master of the known universe. Paul Atreides has spent his night in anonymity. For a few hours, he has escaped the suffocating luxury of his keep. He has watched the mundane activities of everyday life with a profound envy. He has heard the common curses of the marketplace and watched mendicant pilgrims clamoring for a glimpse of the Godhead. To walk a public street without being noticed, this is the greatest privilege Paul can imagine. For a man who sees the future, the present is the only place he can find a moment of peace. Paul returns to his quarters. He is exhausted, but the tiredness stops at his muscles. His mind is seething. He strips off his still suit, the smell of rancid lubricant and desert dust filling the air. He stands naked in his room, feeling the rough texture of green carpeting against his feet, a luxury that would have been unthinkable on the old Arrakis. He realizes the paradox. Dune is a world under siege, yet it is the center of all power, and to be the center of power is to be the target of every blade in the dark. The door hangings swish open. Chani enters. After 12 years, she still moves with a fragile power, self-contained and vulnerable all at once. Her face is darkly elfin, seemingly untouched by the passage of time, save for the sand tracks, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes that the Fremen wear as a badge of survival. She prepares the coffee service. The pot is silver, shaped like a pregnant woman, a ghanima, a spoil of war. Paul remembers the man he killed to win it, Jamis. It is a haunting thought. Jamis has achieved a strange kind of immortality. His death bought the life Paul now leads. Paul looks at himself in a mirror. He sees the blue in blue eyes of the spice addict, the sharp Atreides nose. He looks like his grandfather, the old duke who died in the bull ring. He remembers the old man's words, "One who rules assumes irrevocable responsibility for the ruled. You are a husbandman." But Paul asks himself, what have I done for the Atreides name? I've loosed the wolf among the sheep. He thinks of the 61 billion dead in the jihad. He thinks of the violence being done in his name at this very moment across 1,000 worlds. Chani notices his anger. She sat down at the foot of the bed and began rubbing the knotted muscles of his legs. This is their private sanctum, far removed from what the public imagines as an emperor's palace. Then she speaks, softly, casually, but the words are a blade. Let us discuss Irulan's desire for a child. Paul's eyes snap open. Irulan has been back from the Bene Gesserit homeworld for less than 2 days and already her presence is felt. Paul uses his mental alertness, the Bene Gesserit way his mother taught him, to read Chani. He hates doing this to her. Chani is practical. She doesn't care about romance. She cares about the position of her man. She suggests that Paul should impregnate Irulan. Why? To disconcert our enemies. If Irulan carries an Atreides child, the Bene Gesserit will no longer trust her. She would be vulnerable. Paul feels a lump in his throat. He knows what this request has cost Chani. She is offering to share her man with another woman, her rival, just to protect him. Chani, beloved, he says, I swore an oath never to take her into my bed. A child would give her too much power. Would you have her displace you? Chani's reply is a whisper of Fremen stoicism. I have no place. She calls him Muad'Dib, but she thinks of him as Usul. She is worried. If she cannot produce an heir, then someone else must. This is a Fremen decision. Fremen women have shared their men for thousands of years to ensure the survival of the tribe. Chani is applying the logic of the desert to the throne of the universe. Paul remembers his encounter with Irulan earlier that day. The room smelled of disaster, a bad omen in Fremen culture. Irulan is a princess of the blood royal, but to Paul, she is a questionable alliance. He sees the fear beneath her mask of control. The sisterhood has assigned her a task she hates. I must have a child, she demands. Paul shakes his head. No. Irulan snaps. She threatens to find another lover, to cuckold him and dare him to expose her. She wants a royal heir, no matter who the father is. Paul's response is chilled with the cold kindness of a tyrant. Cuckold me all you wish, but no child. I'd have you garroted if it came to that. The silence that follows is deafening. Paul tells her the truth of their marriage. You play a part, no more. We both know who my wife is. He tells her that fate, her father, the Bene Gesserit and the guild chose her for this position. But they did not choose her to bear his heir. He reminds her that he won the right to control the bloodline when he smashed her father's legions on the plains of Arrakeen. It's on your head then, Irulan says, and she sweeps out of the room, her heart full of bitterness. Back in the bedchamber, Paul tells Chani his decision. No child. He's angry. He tells her Irulan is not a character in a romantic novel. She is a product of imperial intrigue. Plotting is as natural to her as breathing. To give her a child is to give her a weapon. Chani warns him. Irulan reeks of secret decisions. Paul strokes Chani's hair. He feels a Coriolis wind in his soul. A storm of terrible purpose. He whispers to her, do you know what I'd spend to end the jihad, to separate myself from the damnable godhead the Kwisatz forces onto me? Chani tells him, he's the emperor. He can simply command it to stop. But Paul knows better. I'm a figurehead. When godhead's given, that's the one thing the so-called god no longer controls. Even if he died tonight, his name would continue to lead the religious butchery of the jihad. He's unchanged from the rings of fate, but his name is not. Chani suggests they return to Sietch Tabr. She wants to take him away from this tent of stone and back to the safety of the deep desert. The tribes expect Muad'Dib to return to them. You belong to us, she says. I belong to a vision, Paul whispers. He thinks of the jihad. He thinks of the gene mingling across the stars. He sees a way to end it, but the price is terrifying. He never wanted to be a god. He wanted to disappear like a jewel of dew in the morning. He wanted to escape the angels and the damned. Chani tells him a story of a giant sandworm seen near the shield wall, a worm over 100 meters long. The Fremen say it came to summon Muad'Dib home to his desert. This triggers a vision within vision for Paul. An Adab memory. He sees a line of Fremen parading past a gap in the rocks, carrying a long, cloth-wrapped burden. In the vision, he hears his own voice. "It was mostly sweet, but you were the sweetest of all." Paul is shaken. He realizes he has succumbed to the lure of the oracle. He wonders, does the oracle tell the future, or does the oracle make the future? By looking at the threads of time, has he trapped himself in a spider future that is now advancing on him with terrifying jaws? Paul looks at his garden. To an off-worlder, it is beautiful. To a Fremen, it is a cribe, a lavish waste of life-giving water. He has remade the planet's landscape, but in doing so, he has destroyed the old ways. The water sellers hate him. The tribes who fought for every drop of moisture now find themselves in a world they don't recognize. He asks himself, was it not presumptuous to think he could make over an entire planet? And if he succeeds here, what will the rest of the universe think? Will they fear that he will do the same to them? He closes the draperies, sealing out the night. In the darkness, he hears the tinkling of Chani's water rings, the sound of her movements like the arms bells of pilgrims. He finds her in the dark. Her arms enclose him, and in her embrace, he feels his future being held. "Beloved," she whispers, "have I troubled you?" "Not you," Paul says. "Oh, not you." The Emperor of the universe is safe for now, in the arms of the woman he loves. But outside the walls of his keep, the spider future is spinning its web. The Ghola is coming, the conspiracy is moving, and the water of Arrakis is beginning to flow in ways that Muad'Dib can no longer control.